It always began the same way, with silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind that settles over a sleeping American fire support base at 2 in the morning. This silence was different. It felt wrong, unnatural, predatory. The veterans who survived those nights would later say they sensed something before the attack came. A heaviness in the air, a strange stillness in the concertina wire, the faint, metallic taste of danger rising in the back of the throat, and then, nothing. Just the hum of generators, the soft clatter of boots on metal walkways, the distant thunder of artillery tubes cooling after the day's fire missions, a few GIs smoking by the bunkers, a radio operator murmuring into a handset, a sentry fighting off sleep, staring at the dark tree line. No one saw them. No one heard them. No one even suspected they were already inside the perimeter. The NVA Sappers, North Vietnam's silent assault commandos, were moving, and the Americans had no idea that the gate to hell was already swinging open. The deadliest men no one knew were there. To American grunts, the war had its patterns. Daytime meant patrols, airstrikes, ambushes, and the constant thump of Huey rotors. Nighttime meant flares, trip flares, claymores, listening posts, and the uneasy knowledge that the enemy liked darkness more than Americans ever would. But sapper attacks broke every pattern. They didn't test the wire. They didn't probe defenses. They didn't shoot first to draw return fire. They infiltrated, barefoot, stripped down to shorts, sometimes just underwear. Bodies greased in charcoal, soap, or mud, so they shined like black specters under moonlight. No helmets, no boots, no web gear, no unnecessary weight. Just wire cutters, satchel charges, grenades, beltknives, and the iron discipline of a unit trained to kill artillery bases in total silence. The Americans had never faced anything like them before. Many still don't understand exactly what these men were. They weren't regular infantry. They weren't guerrillas. They weren't suicide squads, though many died. They were specialists, hand-picked from the North Vietnamese army, trained for one purpose: break into America's most fortified positions and kill everything inside before anyone knew what was happening. The anatomy of a perfect nightmare. On paper, a U.S. fire support base was a fortress. 3 or 4 rings of concertina wire, trip flares, claymores, LP divided by OP teams, listening posts, observation posts, machine gun bunkers, mortar pits, howitzers surrounded by sandbags stacked to the sky. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of men armed to the teeth. But the sappers studied American bases the way a locksmith studies tumblers. They learned the rotation of guards, the blind spots between towers, the intervals between illumination flares, the sound patterns of generators, radios, and artillery crews. Every detail mattered. And when the moment was right, a dark night, light wind, overcast sky, the sappers came crawling, literally, belly to the dirt, slow as death itself, cutting wire inches at a time. One mistake, one click of metal, one accidental rustle of grass, and they would be torn apart by machine gun fire. But they didn't make mistakes. They bypassed claymores by pushing them aside with bamboo poles. They crawled through wire like snakes. They carried blocks of C4 sealed in plastic, held gently between their teeth. Some pulled themselves forward with their elbows, letting their legs drag silently behind. They got so close to American bunkers that soldiers later reported seeing shapes they thought were shadows, until the shadows suddenly threw satchel charges. The moment Americans realized who they were fighting. When the first explosions ripped through the perimeter, it was already too late. Artillery tubes blew apart before their crews could reach them. Bunkers vanished in sprays of sandbags and fire. Mortar pits erupted like volcanoes. Ammunition dumps detonated into fireballs visible for miles. The Americans inside the base were thrown from their cots, scrambling for weapons, boots, flak jackets, anything, while the night turned into a hurricane of explosions and screams. GIs who survived these attacks often described the same horrifying realization. The enemy wasn't at the wire. He was already inside the base. Dozens of them, everywhere at once. Somehow, impossibly, the sappers had infiltrated a fortress. And that's when a phrase began spreading among American troops. They're the ones who opened the gate to hell. Because sappers didn't just attack, they unleashed something. Something violent. Something sudden. Something unstoppable. Once they breached the perimeter, the fire support base, America's strongest symbol of battlefield dominance, became a trap. For the men inside, the gatekeepers of hell, the Americans who fought them would remember those nights differently from any firefight, ambush, or jungle patrol. These were not battles. These were eruptions. Explosions of violence delivered by men who moved like phantoms and struck like demolition experts, possessed by fury and precision. NVA Sappers didn't just break defenses. They shattered the belief that U.S. firebases were safe. They rewrote the rules of base defense. They forced Americans to accept an ugly truth. The strongest walls mean nothing if the enemy can walk through them without a sound. And so the name stuck. Whispered at first, spoken with awe later, carved into American memory forever. The gatekeepers of hell. Before a sapper ever crawled through a wire, slipped past a claymore mine, or cut a path into an American fire support base, he had to endure a transformation unlike anything else in the North Vietnamese military. Sappers were not ordinary soldiers. They were built slowly, painfully, deliberately through a process designed to erase fear, erase hesitation, and erase every instinct except the instinct to move forward in silence. Every man who volunteered for the sapper arm knew two things. The missions were suicidal, and the expectations were absolute. These men were the tip of the spear for some of the most daring assaults of the entire war. The human scalpel the NVA used when artillery and infantry could not do the job. They weren't chosen because they were strong. They were chosen because they were disciplined, patient, and willing to work in the dark while the rest of the world slept. Selection began with observation. Commanders looked for men who didn't just obey orders but executed them calmly under pressure. Recruits had to be lean, agile, and sharp-eyed. The jungle favored those who moved like it did, quietly, efficiently, without wasted energy. Candidates were watched for weeks without knowing they were being evaluated. A man who panicked during night movement, who stumbled through brush, who breathed too heavily under stress, gone. A man who handled explosives carelessly, gone. A man who talked loudly or needed guidance for every decision, gone. By the time the list was finalized, only a fraction remained. These were the future sappers. Training began before dawn and ended long after dusk. Every single skill they learned aimed at one goal: approach, breach, destroy. They crawled across gravel until their elbows bled. They practiced walking on bamboo poles without making them sway. They learned to use breath as a weapon, short, shallow, silent. They memorized routes using only moonlight. They learned to cut wire fences with nothing but a single snip, leaving no vibration that a sentry could hear. They trained in humidity so dense it drowned lungs, carrying satchels filled with sand to simulate explosives. Failure was not corrected, it was punished with more training, more crawling, more exhaustion until the body stopped complaining. Explosives training was brutal. Sappers were expected to know how to build, arm, and deploy charges by feel alone. They learned to work blindfolded because many real missions took place in pitch-black conditions. They trained with TNT, C4, dynamite, homemade charges, satchel bombs, Bangalore torpedoes, anything the NVA could procure or improvise. They learned not only how to blow things up, but when. A premature blast didn't just kill the mission. It killed the entire assault force. Timing had to be perfect. Placement had to be exact. A single mistake transformed a silent killer into a dead one. Their physical endurance had to surpass every regular infantryman. Sappers carried just enough gear to kill, and not an ounce more. But what they lacked in weight, they made up for in intensity. They marched at night for days, surviving on handfuls of rice, moving through terrain where one misstep meant breaking the silence. They rehearsed raid paths dozens of times until every movement became reflex. They practiced slipping through barbed wire fields, layered 3, 4, sometimes 6 levels deep. They learned to probe the ground with their fingertips for mines, to listen for the faint click of a tripwire, to smell recently touched metal in the dark. The psychological training was even harsher. Sappers had to accept that the moment they were discovered, Their chance of survival dropped close to zero. They weren't shock troops. They were infiltrators. They weren't expected to win gunfights. They were expected to avoid them entirely. Fear had to be buried so deep it couldn't reach the hands. Their instructors hammered one lesson over and over. The quiet man lives. The noisy man dies. No coughs. No whispers. No footsteps heavier than a leaf falling. To forge this mindset, they trained under staged bombardments, night ambushes, surprise flares, simulated claymore blasts. They learned never to freeze, never to hesitate, never to stop moving until the job was done. Even their sense of time changed. Minutes didn't matter. Only openings did, tiny windows in which a guard turned his head. A spotlight rotated away. A patrol line stepped into shadow. Sappers learned to see those windows instinctively. Finally came the testing missions, small infiltrations, demolition tasks, trial runs under live ammunition. A recruit who passed these trials wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a blade sharpened to a terrifying edge. He could crawl through grass without disturbing dew. He could slip past a guard whose boots were close enough to touch. He could reach a target without leaving a footprint anyone could follow. By the end of training, a sapper wasn't fearless, but he was controlled. He understood death intimately and walked with it at his side. His identity dissolved into a single purpose: open the gate, breach the line, let the larger force in. For American troops trying to sleep inside their firebases, these men weren't simply raiders or infiltrators. They were the ones who opened the gates of hell. The night belonged to them, not because they owned it, but because they became it. Sappers didn't move through darkness, they dissolved into it, threaded through it, shaped it around themselves like a cloak. If American firebases were built to withstand artillery, rockets, even full frontal assaults, they were never built to withstand what came crawling toward them on silent feet. The approach was the most dangerous phase of any sapper mission. One mistake meant the entire team died in a storm of machine gun fire. One snapped twig, one glint of moonlight, one cough at the wrong moment, and the attack collapsed. But when sappers approached correctly, the base never knew it was under attack until the first explosion punched a hole straight into its heart. That was the art. That was the nightmare. That was how they opened the gate to hell. The crawl begins. A sapper team rarely began its approach in a straight line. They moved in arcs, curves, crescent shapes, anything that made their path unpredictable. They avoided open ground, avoided dry leaves, avoided anything that could betray them. Every inch mattered. They crawled on elbows and knees, sometimes flat on their stomachs, pushing their weapons ahead of them like hunters stalking prey. Their movement was so slow it barely counted as movement at all, an inch every few seconds, a foot every few minutes. Some firebases reported hearing a rustle hours before an attack. Most heard nothing. The jungle around them masked everything: crickets, frogs, night wind slipping through elephant grass, the distant thump of artillery from another sector. American sentries listened for human sounds. Sappers made none. Timing with nature. A disciplined sapper never moved in silence. He moved inside sound. That was the key. They learned to step when the wind blew, shift their bodies when crickets changed rhythm, advance during the distant rumble of artillery or the passing drone of a helicopter. They synchronized their heartbeat with the environment. When a sentry coughed, they pushed forward. When boots scraped across gravel, they surged another foot. When flares went up, they froze not for seconds, but for minutes. Faces in the dirt, bodies pressed so close to the ground they felt the vibration of their own pulse. When the flare died, they moved again, slow as a shadow stretching across the earth. Cutting the wire. Every American firebase relied on wire. Barbed wire, concertina coils, trip flares, noisemakers made from ration cans filled with pebbles. These were designed to stop infantry, not sappers. They approached the wire like surgeons approaching a patient. They reached forward with small, padded clamps that muffled vibration. They lifted coils gently so they didn't scrape. They cut at angles that prevented sharp ends from springing back and making noise. Sometimes they used bamboo poles to lift entire sections of wire. Sometimes they crawled under it, belly flat to the earth. And sometimes, when the ground was soft or the wire too tight, they dug. inch by inch, finger by finger, creating a channel just deep enough to slide through. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was painfully slow, wet, muddy, mosquito-filled work. But it worked, neutralizing the guards. Sappers didn't rely on luck to slip past sentries, they relied on precision. A base might have 100 soldiers on the perimeter, but only a handful were awake, alert, and in the right place at the right moment. Sappers mapped guard rotations by watching from a distance over multiple nights. They learned which towers had lazy sentries, which guards smoked, who talked too much, who stared into the darkness, and who stared at the ground, where the blind spots overlapped. When they reached the outer perimeter, they often lay still and listened, studying each guard's rhythm. Guards were human. Humans get predictable. When the guard turned, a sapper moved 6 inches. When the guard leaned on the rail, he moved another 6. When the guard started talking to the next tower, he moved a foot. Slow, controlled, calculated. Some sappers were close enough to hear sentries breathing. The last stretch, inside the wire, the base looked deceptively quiet. A few tents lit by lamps. The outlines of howitzers sleeping under tarps. The smell of diesel and gun oil. Voices drifting from a mess tent. A radio playing soft rock off-duty troops hoped would drown the darkness. This was the moment sappers waited for. The moment when the Americans felt safe. The moment when the night was calm enough to hide death. The team gathered behind small dips in the ground, checking each other's gear one last time. No words, only hand signals. The commander scanned the target. Ammo dump, fire direction center, gun pit, fuel tank, barracks. They didn't need many charges. 1 satchel per gun, 1 bundle of TNT per bunker, 1 shaped charge for the FDC. The goal wasn't to fight the base. The goal was to break. There is a moment in every sapper assault when the world seems to hold its breath. Not a rustle of grass, not a shift of wind, not even the faint buzz of insects. Just silence, thick, unnatural, electric. And somewhere inside that silence, a sapper lies belly down against the dirt, inches from the outer wire of an American firebase, waiting for the exact heartbeat when the night finally belongs to him. For American troops manning those lonely hilltop firebases, this moment was invisible. They didn't see the danger crawling toward them. They didn't hear the gatekeepers of hell moving through the shadows. All they felt too late was the blast. But every blast, every breach, every overrun began with a single kill. And on this night, the first kill was seconds away. The final stretch, reaching the perimeter, was only half the battle. The real war began inside the wire. By the time the sappers crawled to the last roll of concertina, their bodies were coated in dust and sweat. Their mouths tasted like metal. Their hearts thumped so hard they feared it might shake the wire itself. The American firebase below them looked deceptively quiet, barrels stacked, guns at rest, men on radio watch, silhouettes pacing slow arcs atop their bunkers. The defenders believed the jungle bought them space. They believed trip flares, claymores, and towering berms were enough. They were wrong, because the sappers didn't come to probe defenses. They came to rip the heart out of the base in under 10 minutes. But first, they needed to create a doorway. And that doorway began with one man, the gatekeeper. The first target was always the same, the nearest sentry. The man whose flashlight beam cut through the dark. The man whose cigarette glow floated just above the parapet. The man whose rifle leaned slightly, casually, against his shoulder. He was the thin line between peace and catastrophe. Tonight, he stood 20 feet from the wire, hands tucked beneath his armpits, shifting from foot to escape the night cold. He didn't know death was crawling toward him. He didn't know the jungle behind him was alive with movement. The sapper assigned to the first kill inhaled, held his breath, and waited for the exact moment the sentry turned his head. Not when the sentry looked toward him, only when he looked away. A shadow rose from the grass. 2 steps. 3. A blade flashed once. The sentry collapsed without a sound. The gatekeeper was gone. The door was open, and the firebase had no idea. Open the gate. With the sentry removed, the sappers moved with frightening speed. Wire cutters whispered through metal. Satchel charges were placed with careful precision, each one positioned not to destroy the base, but to shock it, to create blind spots, to force American defenders out of their bunkers into kill zones already mapped in the sappers' minds. A whispered code passed down the line. Soft, controlled, final. Open the gate. 2 sappers crawled forward with the breaching charge, a brutal bag of explosives wrapped in canvas and nails. They pressed it against the weakest point in the wire, set the fuse, and retreated no more than 10 yards. Their faces remained calm. They had done this before. Many times. Too many times. The fuse burned like a dying firefly. Then the world tore open. The first blast. The explosion shattered the night. The shockwave rolled across the firebase like a physical punch. Dirt lifted. Flares ignited. Alarms screamed. American soldiers jolted awake, scrambling for rifles, boots, helmets, anything that could help them make sense of the chaos. But the sappers didn't wait for confusion. They thrived on it. The moment the breach opened, they surged inside small, fast-moving shapes carrying nothing but AKs, satchel charges, and the absolute clarity of a mission that demanded speed over survival. One team ran straight for the gun pits. Another sprinted toward the ammo dump. A third moved like shadows along the berm toward the FDC, the Fire Direction Center, the real brain of the base. Each man knew exactly where to run. They had memorized the layout from stolen maps, aerial photos, and days of silent observation. To the Americans, the attack felt chaotic. To the sappers, it was choreography. The collapse. Inside the wire, the fight lasted minutes, sometimes less. A mortar tube erupted as its crew was cut down. A howitzer platform vanished in a cloud of fire as a satchel charge detonated beneath it. Fuel drums ignited, spraying orange flames into the sky. The radio bunker blinked out as another blast swallowed its entrance. Most devastating of all, the FDC, the brain controlling every artillery piece, fell under a coordinated charge. With it destroyed, the firebase's guns went blind. The defenders were suddenly fighting without vision, without communication, without direction. And that was when the Americans understood the truth. They weren't dealing with infiltrators. They weren't dealing with raiders. They were dealing with specialists whose purpose was singular. Open the gates of hell. Let the enemy flood in. Burn the base from the inside out. By the time the Americans reorganized and counterattacked, the sappers were already fading into the night mission complete. Losses accepted. Legacy sealed. They left behind flames, twisted metal, shattered bunkers, and a phrase the survivors would repeat for years. It felt like they came from inside the earth. The Americans had a simpler name: the Gatekeepers of Hell. The truth hit American commanders too late. By the time the first claymore was flipped backward, by the time the first satchel charge turned a bunker into a funeral pyre, by the time the first scream ripped through the darkness, the firebase wasn't fighting for victory anymore. It was fighting for survival. And it was fighting the clock. Because once the first sapper got inside the wire, the countdown had started. 10 minutes, sometimes less, until everything collapsed. To understand why, you have to see the battlefield not from the map table but through the eyes of the men inside the perimeter. Men who went from calm to chaos in the time it takes to draw one breath. It begins the same way every time. A sudden, impossible explosion, exactly where no enemy should be. Inside the perimeter. Inside the heart of the base. Inside the safe zone. That psychological blow alone shaved minutes off the defense. Soldiers weren't bracing for an attack, they were jolted awake by one that had already matured. A single fact defined every sapper raid. The fight didn't start at the wire. The fight started behind it. And when the defenders turned to face the blast, they found the enemy wasn't at the fence, they were at the ammo dump, the gun pits, the commo bunker, the TOC. By the time defenders oriented themselves, the sapper attack was already unfolding in its final stages. The first-minute shock, the first blast, wasn't only destructive. It was disorienting. Most American soldiers were asleep or half awake. They didn't have formation, coordination, or direction. They had confusion. Sappers counted on that. A backwards claymore could kill every man in a bunker before they even grabbed their boots. A satchel charge thrown through a firing slit could turn a fortified position into shredded sandbags and broken bodies. The first minute wasn't about destroying assets. It was about destroying order. Without order, there would be no coordinated response. And without a coordinated response, the base was already lost. Minute 2, darkness turns against the defenders. Light was supposed to save the American positions. Flares, searchlights, illumination rounds. But in the second minute, those tools became liabilities. A single sapper with a captured M79 or a stolen flare gun could blind an entire defensive line, forcing defenders to fight behind a curtain of white light while the attackers moved in shadow. Sandbags lit by flares became silhouettes. Gun crews became targets. Paths between bunkers became glowing kill lanes. Sappers weren't afraid of light. They weaponized it. And because they were already inside the perimeter, the defenders couldn't create a clean field of fire. Every direction risked friendly fire. Every burst of a machine gun risked hitting their own. The base was beginning to fold. Minute 3 to 5. The choke points collapse. Firebases were designed to repel assaults from outside, not from within. Once sappers breached the interior, the base turned into a maze of fatal bottlenecks. Narrow trenches, single-file walkways, blind corners, sandbag bunkers blocking lateral fire. Every movement defenders made was predictable. Every movement sappers made was not. A single attacker with a satchel charge could erase an entire gun pit. A second attacker could cut communication wires or destroy radios. A third could collapse the ammo point with one well-placed explosive. In 5 minutes, a base lost its artillery, communications on command, heavy weapons, coordination. What remained was a scattered group of men firing at shadows while the perimeter burned. Minute 6 to 8, the fire becomes the enemy. This was the point where most bases were doomed, even if they didn't realize it. Fuel drums ruptured. Illumination rounds cooked off. Wooden structures ignited. Gun pits turned into ovens. Ammo bunkers detonated in chain reactions that drowned the battlefield in shockwaves and shrapnel. Fire didn't discriminate. It burned the attackers. It burned the defenders. It burned the base itself. Sappers didn't need to destroy everything. They only needed to start the fire. The base did the rest. American soldiers described these moments as the longest seconds of my life, because survival depended on instinct, not strategy. You didn't fight the enemy. You fought the flames, the smoke, the explosions. You fought to stay conscious. You fought to stay alive. Meanwhile, the sappers slipped away through the same gaps they had carved minutes earlier. They didn't stay to fight. They didn't wait for reinforcements. They vanished back into the tree line as the base burned behind them. Minute 9 to 10 collapse. Not defeat. Collapse. Command and control gone. Artillery silent. Perimeter broken. Ammo cooking off. Radio net dead. Flare smoke choking the trenches. In 10 minutes, a firebase that had taken months to build could be reduced to a burning crater of twisted steel and shattered bunkers. And the most terrifying part? Most defenders never saw the men who did it. They heard footsteps. They heard explosions. They heard screams. But they rarely saw the sappers themselves. That's why Americans gave them a name that survived the war, the ones who opened the gates of hell. Because once a sapper got inside the wire, hell didn't come later. Hell came immediately. And it did its work in 10 minutes. The question haunted American commanders long after the war ended. How does a handful of men barefoot, half naked, carrying nothing but explosives and wire cutters slip past layers of claymores, trip flares, machine gun towers, guard posts, and concertina wire strong enough to stop a truck? It didn't seem possible. Not in the doctrine of the U.S. Army. Not in the logic of fortified warfare. But the sappers didn't obey logic. They exploited it. Every U.S. mistake, every blind spot, every assumption, the sappers studied, memorized, and weaponized. They didn't overpower firebases. They unmade them one flaw at a time. 1. The defensive bubble was built for a different enemy. American firebases were designed to stop one thing: Mass assaults, waves of infantry, human wave charges, battalion-size pushes. They were not designed for 6 men crawling in the mud, low to the ground, carrying satchels of TNT and Bangalore torpedoes, moving with no metal, no noise, no silhouette. Claymores pointed outward, waiting for large formations. Machine guns were in place to sweep open ground. Artillery pits were placed for counter-battery fire. None of it mattered against a threat that approached from angles no one expected. Under the wire, through the drainage ditches, along the unused dead ground, or crawling through the gaps no one bothered to check. Firebases were built to repel armies. They were not built to repel ghosts with explosives. 2. Overconfidence became a weapon used against us. By 1968, 1970, many U.S. firebases were operating with exhausted crews and predictable routines. Guards walked the same routes every night. Trip flares were placed in the same familiar places. Claymores stayed wired in but rarely tested. Towers scanned the same arcs over and over. Predictability is the death of security. The sappers watched, night after night, sometimes for weeks. They memorized guard rotations down to the minute. They mapped where the beams of spotlights overlapped and where they didn't. They identified when towers were manned by rookies and when by veterans. They learned the moments when boredom replaced vigilance. In their notebooks after the war, several sappers wrote the same chilling sentence: Americans feared an attack they could see. We gave them one they could not imagine. 3. Technology failed when the enemy chose to become primitive. Firebases depended on technology sensors, trip flares, claymores, machine guns, radios, illumination flares. Sappers depended on their body's strength, silence, patience, nerve. The Americans looked outward through night vision devices and binoculars. The sappers crawled inside the blind spots, inches from the wire. U.S. engineers laid overlapping layers of metal obstacles. The sappers removed their belts, their buttons, even their earrings, becoming non-metallic shadows the sensors couldn't detect. The Americans placed faith in perimeter mines. The sappers learned to probe the earth with fingertips, like readers scanning Braille. The Americans wired flares to explode upward. The sappers covered them with wet sand or used long bamboo poles to press them safely aside. A modern fortress, defeated by an ancient threat. 4. The U.S. misread the sapper mindset. Americans assumed the sappers would break under fear, panic under fire, hesitate before detonating themselves inside a base full of guns. They were wrong. The sappers were not normal infantry. They were not raid teams. They were not saboteurs. They were single-mission soldiers trained to accept death before they began crawling. While Americans fought to survive the night, sappers crawled in believing they had already died. That is not a mindset you can counter with floodlights and trip flares. 5. The sheer speed of the attack overwhelmed everyone. A firebase might have 150 men, sea rations stockpiled, artillery tubes loaded, machine guns positioned, mortars in the pit, radio nets buzzing with communication. But once the sappers got inside the wire, none of it mattered. Explosions from satchel charges knocked out power. Mortar pits erupted before anyone could find a helmet. Ammo dumps went up in fireballs that blinded entire perimeters. Command bunkers collapsed before orders could be issued. Illumination flares were never fired. 10 minutes, sometimes less. The firebase wasn't defeated in a firefight. It was dismantled systematically, surgically, instantly. ***6. The Americans expected a battle. The sappers delivered an execution. Firebases were prepared to fight. They were prepared to repel. They were prepared to defend. They were not prepared for a killing team that bypassed every layer of protection and attacked the heart first. Gun crews, artillery tubes, ammo dumps, towers, command bunkers. A battle implies two sides exchanging blows. A sapper attack wasn't a battle. It was a demolition sequence disguised as an attack. By the time defenders understood what was happening, the sappers had already achieved their objectives. The firebase was burning. Communications were down. Ammunition was exploding. Artillery was silent. Leadership was dead or wounded. The sappers didn't fight for ground. They fought for collapse. And they almost always got it. It began like every other night in the mountains of Quang Tin Province, thick fog rolling low across the ridgeline, air heavy with the smell of wet earth and rotting bamboo, the dim outline of firebase Mary Ann glowing faintly under the moon. To the men of the 1/46th Infantry, it felt routine. Too quiet? Maybe, but routine. No one knew they were minutes away from the most shocking breach of an American firebase in the entire Vietnam War. No one knew the fog outside wasn't just weather. It was cover. A cloak. A gift to the killers already inside the wire. And the killers were only 12 men. 12 NVA Sappers, armed with nothing louder than knives, grenades, and satchel charges, moving through the mist like shadows born from the earth. At 2:30, they reached the perimeter. At 2:32, the first man was dead. By 2:50, Firebase Mary Ann was no longer an American base. Just fire, smoke, and screams. The quietest infiltration of the war, Mary Ann wasn't a major fortress. It was a small support firebase sitting on a ridge, manned by about 60 Americans and a group of South Vietnamese forces. It had bunkers, wire, claymores, and trip flares, but everything depended on alertness. And that night, alertness died long before the first explosion. The sappers crawled through the elephant grass and thorn brush, faces masked in charcoal and grease, bodies wrapped only in loincloths and moccasin-like slippers to eliminate sound. They carried wire cutters made from bamboo, bags of explosives tied to their backs, and most deadly of all, absolute silence. They slipped through gaps in the wire, gaps no one had fixed. They padded past claymores no one had turned toward the jungle. They passed guard towers where sentries slept, or smoked, or stared bored into the fog without seeing the silhouettes approaching them. The sappers didn't fire a shot. They didn't need to. Mary Ann was already compromised. 2:33, the first kill. The first American to die never woke up. A sapper slid into the Tactical Operations Center like a shadow under a door, raised a Chicom grenade in one hand, and slit the throat of the radioman sitting half asleep in the corner. Before the grenade even clattered to the floor, he was gone, melting back into the fog. The explosion inside the TOC wasn't huge, but it was deliberate. It stunned everyone. It blinded the staff. It ruptured eardrums. It killed command cohesion in one heartbeat. And worst of all, it wiped out communications. Half the base never received an order that night. The other half received only screams. 2:34, 2:40 fire in every direction. The sappers moved bunker to bunker, slicing tent walls with knives, dropping satchel charges into sleeping quarters, tossing grenades into mortar pits, firing bursts from captured American weapons only when absolutely necessary. Some Americans died still lying in their cots. Some died charging half-dressed into the open, unsure where the attack was coming from. Some never even understood they were under attack. The fog glowed red as burning tents lit the night. Smoke, dust, blood all swirling together. Confusion became a battlefield. Any firebase under attack expects enemy fire from outside the wire. But Mary Ann was different. The enemy was already inside. Close enough to touch, close enough to breathe on the men they killed. Mortar rounds stored improperly ignited, sending a chain reaction through the ammo dump. Debris rained down like shrapnel falling from the sky. Machine guns on the perimeter jammed or were unmanned. Claymores never detonated. And through the flames, the sappers kept moving. Methodically, professionally, without hesitation. 2:41, the collapse. By now, the Americans who could fight were fighting blind. Some fired at shadows. Some fired at the fog. Some sprinted from bunker to bunker, only to realize each one was already destroyed. Each position burned out. Each mortar pit silenced. Inside the TOC, officers tried to coordinate a defense. But the power was gone. Half the radios were destroyed. And thick smoke made it impossible to breathe. Orders broke down, then dissolved entirely. Mary Ann wasn't a firebase anymore. It was a burning trap. The sappers had no intention of holding the base. They only had one mission: kill, destroy, withdraw. They were nearly done. 248 exit back into the fog. As suddenly as they came, the sappers disappeared, sliding through smoke and darkness as explosions still echoed. Every man followed the planned route. Every man vanished the same way he entered, without a sound. Some weren't so lucky. Several sappers died inside the wire. But they didn't need all 12. They had already done the unthinkable. When the last explosion faded, when the screams quieted, when the fog finally thinned, Firebase Mary Ann looked like the opening of hell. 30 American soldiers were dead or dying, scores wounded, nearly every structure damaged or destroyed. And the question hung over the battlefield like a curse. How did 12 men walk through the wire and destroy an entire firebase in minutes? American commanders in Vietnam faced many threats: ambushes along jungle trails, improvised mines, RPG swarms, sudden mortar attacks, and the brutal attrition of open field engagements. But nothing, absolutely nothing, unnerved them the way a sapper attack did. Because a firefight was predictable. Artillery could be plotted. Human wave assaults could be broken. Helicopter gunships could tear apart anything that moved. But sappers? Sappers were silent men already inside your perimeter before your brain even registered danger. It wasn't the noise of the explosion that terrified commanders. It was the moment every commander's nightmare when a frantic radio call would cut the night. They're inside the wire. That sentence meant one thing: everything you thought was secure isn't. Everything you built is collapsing. And everyone under your command is seconds away from chaos. The first lesson: no warning, no shape, no pattern. Americans could predict VC tactics most of the time. They knew ambush zones. They recognized booby trap signatures. They understood infiltration routes. But sappers didn't follow rules. They didn't come the same way twice. They didn't probe defenses the classic VC way. A sapper attack offered no mortar prep, no probing fire, no distant movement, no rustle in the wire, no trip flare activated, no grenade thrown too early, nothing. Then suddenly, boom, the command bunker evaporated. A machine gun nest fell silent. A fuel depot blossomed into a fireball brighter than dawn. A whole firebase could go from a quiet night to a dying dream in under 2 minutes. To American officers, that was the purest horror. There was no way to anticipate an attack that erased all rules. The second lesson: sappers didn't fight a battle, they ended it. Most NVA units battled for hours. Sappers battled for minutes. Their mission wasn't to overrun. It wasn't to occupy. It wasn't to chase survivors. Their mission was brutally elegant. 1. Decapitate the command structure. 2. Blind communications. 3. Disable firepower. 4. Create confusion the enemy can't recover from. A single satchel charge in the Tactical Operations Center could shatter a firebase's entire chain of command. A well-placed explosive under the communications bunker could wipe out radios, maps, even mortar fire direction. Once the brain was gone, the rest of the base artillerymen, clerks, cooks, infantry, mortar crews were effectively fighting blind. A sapper attack didn't overwhelm a firebase. It removed its ability to think and let the rest of the NVA exploit the wreckage. The third lesson: sappers were willing to die, and Americans knew it. American soldiers respected bravery. They saw it in Marines holding a line, in medics running through fire, in helicopter pilots landing under RPG arcs. But sappers fought with a type of commitment that felt alien. Most were under 20. Most were willing, expected to die. Many carried a single satchel charge with a 5-second fuse and knew the blast radius exceeded any hope of survival. American intelligence units documented dozens of attacks where sappers crawled directly into machine gun arcs, walked through burning wire, charged command bunkers with no cover, detonated charges while still holding them. To U.S. officers, that level of determination was terrifying because you couldn't deter it. You couldn't break its morale. You couldn't outbrave it. You couldn't bargain with it. A sapper didn't fear death. He embraced it if it meant completing his mission. And no commander had an answer for that. The fourth lesson: firepower meant nothing inside the wire. American firebases were built on the assumption that danger came from the outside. When the enemy slipped inside, everything flipped. Claymores pointed outward, machine guns zeroed onto distant arcs, artillery tubes facing open fields, illumination rounds useless, helicopter support delayed, perimeter guards dead in seconds. All the American advantages, air power, artillery, radios, coordination, reinforcing fire, became irrelevant. Inside the wire, battles were fought with rifles at point blank, grenades thrown blind, satchel charges tossed into bunkers, flamethrowers in trenches, hand-to-hand combat in the dark. A firebase wasn't designed to fight for its own soul. It was designed to repel something coming from the outside. Sappers inverted that logic and forced Americans into the kind of primal combat they were never trained for. The fifth lesson: fear that never left. The worst part for American commanders wasn't the attack itself. It was the waiting, the uncertainty, the nights where wind moved through the wire like a breath, the hours when a rat could make a man flinch, the moments when a lone trip flare fizzled for no reason and every heart froze. Officers who'd endured sapper raids described the same feeling. After a sapper attack, the night never feels safe again. The fear lingered. It camped inside the mind. It turned every silent moment into potential doom. Because once you know the enemy can simply walk inside, you never sleep the same again. When dawn finally rolled across a shattered firebase, smoke drifting like torn curtains, sandbags ripped open, bunkers smoldering, bodies carried out under ponchos, it wasn't just the physical destruction that struck American commanders. It was the impossibility of it. How could a handful of men, sometimes 20, sometimes fewer, slip inside a fortified U.S. position protected by trip flares, claymores, guard towers, patrols, and overlapping fields of fire, and erase it in under 10 minutes? Across the fire bases of I Corps and II Corps, from Mary Ann to Ripcord to Fuller, the pattern repeated. The Americans weren't just losing ground, they were losing certainty. And certainty is the foundation of any soldier's sanity. They were already inside before anyone fought back. That single sentence, repeated in dozens of after-action reports, became the most terrifying truth U.S. units had to face. The battle didn't begin when the shooting started. It began when the sappers crossed the wire, and by then, the Americans were already losing. Witnesses described the same surreal moment again and again. A sudden explosion in the TOC, a claymore going off but facing inward, a shadow sprinting through smoke with a satchel charge under one arm, gunfire erupting from inside the sleeping area instead of outside the perimeter. Firebases were built to repel an enemy outside the wire. Nothing in the American defensive mindset had prepared them for an enemy who started the fight in their bedrooms. And that's what NVA Sappers did. They bypassed sentries. They stepped over tripwires without snapping them. They slipped behind machine gun pits and silently cut throats. They crawled under the belly of the base and burst upward like volcanic fire. By the time defenders were awake, armed, and oriented, the firebase was already collapsing inward, like a dying star imploding on itself. The fear that spread faster than the fire. Word traveled quickly in Vietnam. A platoon wiped out in 7 minutes. A mortar pit annihilated before a single tube could fire back. Commanders killed in their bunks. Entire companies routed not by battalions, but by squads of silent infiltrators. For many American soldiers, the fear didn't come from the brutality of sapper attacks. It came from not hearing them. One survivor of FSB Henderson said, "I heard gunfire. I thought the NVA were outside the wire. Then I saw a guy barefoot, shirtless, running past me with a satchel charge. He wasn't outside. He was behind me." Another from FSB Mace recalled, "The whole defense plan felt like a joke. Our walls kept nobody out. These weren't ordinary ambushes. These were psychological ruptures. Moments where American troops realized the truth. If sappers wanted inside, they were already inside. Commanders struggled to explain the impossible. After every major sapper raid, headquarters demanded answers. How did they get through the wire? How did they avoid claymores? How did no one fire a shot until it was too late? How did a dozen men defeat 400 inside a fortified base? And again, the reports told the same story. They came in low. They came in from dead ground. They crawled through the trash ditch. They waited until the guards were swapping shifts. They wore only shorts, nothing to snag, nothing to shine. They carried nothing that made noise. American doctrine at the time had no true counter. You couldn't kill what you couldn't detect. You couldn't stop what you hadn't prepared for. You couldn't react to an enemy who opened the fight in your most vulnerable place. The sappers were not an attack force. They were a precision weapon designed to break confidence, not just bunkers. And it worked. The nightmares never left. Years after the war, many U.S. veterans who survived sapper attacks spoke about a particular kind of trauma, one different from firefights or artillery barrages. This was the trauma of being overrun by ghosts who didn't exist until they were on top of you. Men described waking up in the States decades later, heart racing, certain someone was standing in the bedroom doorway. Others said they slept lightly for years, unable to fully trust quiet, unable to shake the memory of the moment they awoke to explosions inside their own perimeter. One artilleryman said simply, "It wasn't a battle, it was a sudden ending," because for many bases, that's exactly what a sapper raid felt like. Not a fight, not a siege, just 10 minutes of violent erasure. The legacy of terror. By 1971, U.S. tactical guides finally acknowledged the obvious. Sappers were the single most effective small assault force in the NVA arsenal. Period. They forced America to fortify differently. They forced units to sleep armed. They forced commanders to redesign wire patterns, guard rotations, and claymore placement. But the psychological wound left behind? That couldn't be repaired. Not by more sandbags. Not by more guards. Not by more firepower. The damage had already been done the night sappers walked through America's front door. When the Vietnam War finally ended in 1975, the world tried to make sense of what had happened. America counted its dead. Vietnam buried entire generations. And for decades afterward, veterans searched for words to describe the things they had seen in the dark, those moments when war stripped away all pretense and left only raw survival. Almost every American who fought on a firebase carried memories of mortars, rockets, and snipers. Those were familiar threats, predictable, manageable. But there was one enemy they never forgot. One enemy who refused to behave the way war was supposed to work. Men who didn't fire from a distance. Men who didn't run when detected. Men who walked straight into fortified American positions as if entering a burning house and lit the match themselves. The NVA Sappers. The soldiers the Americans quietly called the ones who opened the gates of hell. A weapon built for one purpose. The sapper units of North Vietnam were small, tiny, compared to the massive divisions fighting across the DMZ or the Ho Chi Minh Trail. A typical sapper team attacking a firebase might number 12, maybe 20 men. A few carried carbines or AKs, most didn't. Their true weapons were explosives, satchel charges, Bangalore torpedoes, homemade grenades, and shaped charges meant to gut bunkers, blind towers, and rip the heart out of a base's communications. They weren't meant to defeat the United States Army head-on. They were meant to collapse the skeleton of American firepower by attacking the one place U.S. forces believed could not and should not ever fall: their firebases. A ring of wire, bunkers, claymores, trip flares, machine gun pits, and still the sappers came. A legacy written in fire and silence. Long after the war, American veterans still talk about mortar attacks with a shrug, as if recounting bad weather. But mention a sapper attack, and the tone changes. Voices lower, eyes look away for a second. The memory returns with a clarity sharper than daylight, because it wasn't just violence. It was violation, a breach of a sacred line. A firebase was supposed to be safe behind its wire. A sleeping soldier was supposed to be untouchable inside his bunker. And then one night, without warning, the wire glowed red from cutters, the trip flares remained dark, and a man covered in grease and mud silently crawled inside carrying 20 pounds of explosives and a purpose that bordered on suicidal clarity. Within 10 minutes, the base went from functioning to fighting for its life. Within 20, it was smoke and fire. Within 30, it was a crater. That memory stayed. The Americans who faced them. Ask a U.S. infantry veteran what scared him most in Vietnam. It wasn't dying. Death was everywhere. It wasn't mortars. Those were routine. It wasn't ambushes they were terrifying, but understandable. What terrified him, truly terrified, was the thought of waking up to a sapper inside the wire, standing at the foot of his bunker with a satchel charge in hand. Every firebase had men who slept lightly because of it. Every perimeter guard strained their ears during the 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. shift, the dead hours when sappers like to strike. Every officer carried a quiet fear that one night, the wire wouldn't be enough. Sappers changed the psychology of the war, made every base feel temporary, made every soldier feel exposed, made every quiet night feel like a countdown. Vietnam's shadow warriors. To North Vietnam, the sapper units became national heroes, not because they destroyed American bases, but because they embodied the spirit Hanoi wanted to show the world: discipline, fearlessness, self-sacrifice, and mastery of asymmetry. The war would not be won by matching American power watt for watt. It would be won by using America's own confidence against itself. Firebases were strong because they were static. Static meant predictable. Prédictable mais vulnérable. A sapper unit needed only a gap, a blind spot, one tired guard, one torch, flickering out of rhythm. And then they were inside. The Americans learned that even a fortress could fall if the right man crawled beneath its wire. Remembered by those who survived them. Today, the legacy of the sappers survives in military academies, in the doctrines of modern special operations, and in the stories whispered at reunions. American veterans rarely praise the NVA. They do not romanticize an enemy who killed their friends, but they do respect them. They respect the professionalism, the planning, the willingness to die without hesitation, the nerve required to crawl through wire and explosives and walk straight into a fortified base without a sound. Respect earned the hard way, in the dark, in the mud, face to face. The final truth of the Gatekeepers of Hell. Sappers were not superheroes. They were not invincible. They were not immortal. They succeeded because they understood something simple and eternal. War is not won by strength. War is won by access. Access through the wire. Access to the command bunker. Access to the ammo dump. Access to the heart of a firebase. Give a man access, and you give him the power to decide the fate of an entire battle. The sappers took that truth, sharpened it into doctrine, and carried it into the darkness. And on countless nights in Vietnam, American soldiers woke to find that the gates of hell had swung open because the men who opened them had already stepped inside.